All right. Welcome to the end of the semester. This is one of our last lectures, if not the last lecture for the semester. We're going to be looking at the effect of exercise training on VO2 max and discuss how your VO2 max increases with endurance training. This will be a lot of review, trying to combine the concepts that you've learned from the very beginning of the semester all the way till the end. So we'll talk about fiber types, we'll talk about action potentials, we'll talk about heart size, lots of different things we're going to try and tie together to help you review and prepare for the final exam. All right, so it's no surprise endurance training increases your VO2 max, right? For us to get into that, let's first talk about what the principles of training are, and then we'll go in and talk about how endurance training affects VO2 max. We'll talk about the physiology, and then it's also important to look at how endurance training affects submaximal exercise. So we'll talk about that. Instead of running at your maximum, we'll look at how it affects running at a submaximal pace, like going out for a jog or walking up the stairs. Places where you'll really notice a difference in your everyday life. And then finally, we'll tie it together by looking into a really cool study that examined why the former world record holder for the marathon, Paula Radcliffe, why she was so fast. We have a lot of physiological data on her, and it illustrates a lot of the adaptations that occur with endurance training. All right, so foundational concepts of exercise physiology and exercise training. Remember, if these three things you have to keep in mind when you're training. Number one is you don't get any adaptation unless you overload the system. If you're not overloading the system, it's not going to adapt, right? Your body has this setup of supply and demand. If you put a greater demand on it, if you ask your body to do stuff that it's not used to doing, if you make your heart pump more than it's used to pumping, if you make your muscles lift more than they're used to lifting, the demand is outweighing the supply and you'll get remodeling. But if you only ever ask the heart or the body to do, let's draw it somewhere else. If you only ever ask the body to do what it's used to doing, where you have the demand and the supply matched, you get no adaptation, right? You have to overload or stress the system. Otherwise, you don't get any adaptation. This applies in life too. Really simply put, if you're comfortable all the time, you're not growing. You have to put stress and strain on your body or on your mind in order to grow. You don't grow because of easy things. It applies to physiology, it applies spiritually, mentally, whatever you want. You need a little bit of strain to give your body a reason to grow. Too much strain can be bad, too much stress can be bad, but you do need some. All right, now the other principle here is specificity. Your adaptations that you're going to get are specific to the systems that you're overloading. If I bench press a whole lot, my squat isn't going to change. Okay, it's specific to what you're overloading. And then reversibility. This is the old phrase: if you don't use it, you lose it. Your body's very efficient. If you get to a point where you minimize your demand, and now the supply that you have, like the size of your heart, the size of your muscles, if the supply is more than you're using, more than the demand you put on it, now the supply is outweighing the demand and your body is going to be efficient and cut that supply so that it can restore balance. So you'll have atrophy of the muscles, or you'll lose size in the heart, you'll lose mitochondria, all these different things. Your body's not going to maintain stuff that it doesn't need. So reversibility kind of stinks, but it's what we have to deal with. So let's look at this study. I think I showed you this one earlier in the semester, probably. In this one, they had individuals exercise train one leg at a time. And so from days 0 through 13, it looks like, they trained the right leg. and they measured the heart rate response down here. Let's focus down here. This will be the easiest to start. They measured the heart rate response at day 0 before any training, and their heart doing that exercise was 180 beats per minute. After a couple days, the heart rate response decreased over time. Why would that decrease? Well, there's a couple of things that could be going on. One of them is that you're becoming more accustomed to the exercise. You learn how to recruit the type 1 fibers, which produce less acid and other metabolites. And so they're stimulating the heart rate a little less, right? So the point of this is that we see adaptations when exercising that leg. But then after exercising, training, let's say it's the right leg that they train, now they went back and started training the left, or started exercising the left leg. And when they did that same exercise in the left leg, the heart rate went up high again. Even though the right leg had been training, now you move over to the left leg, no benefit there. So what's going on? The adaptations are specific to the system overloaded. And when you're doing single leg exercise, the systems being overloaded are really just that leg. You're not putting a lot of strain on the heart. The heart probably isn't adapting in this scenario, right? If you're exercising one leg, it requires half the cardiac output that your heart is used to doing when exercising 2 legs. So you're probably not getting a lot of adaptations locally in the heart. All the adaptations are occurring within the muscle and the nervous system. Accordingly, or just similar to what's going on with the heart rate, you see ventilation decrease because the afferents picking up the metabolites produced by the exercise are less stimulated because you're producing less metabolites. Also, the feed forward, how you perceive the exercise over time, is going to be less. And so that initial setting of your heart rate, of your ventilation by the upper brain, it's going to set it to a lower threshold or a lower level because it doesn't perceive it as difficult anymore. Also, you can see less lactate is being produced over time. And then when you exercise the other leg, it's gone, right? So the adaptations are specific to the system being overloaded. But now let's reconcile that with this. Here's a study where they had people either do cycling training, normal training on a bike, or arm cycling training. Sorry for that little spike. I don't know why it does that. So the arm cycling training. So they're either exercising their legs or their arms. And then there's this control group that does nothing. So let's just get this out of the way. The control group, they measured their VO2 max during cycling exercise and during arm cycling exercise. And this is the change. The little triangle in science, when you see a triangle, it's a delta symbol. It means change. And so the control group who did absolutely nothing, they had them come in, let's say January 1st, measured their VO2 max during cycling and arm cycling exercise, and then had them come back a couple months later, 12 weeks later, measured it again. There's no change, same VO2 max as before, okay? So nothing's changing because there's no intervention there. So let's just ignore them for now. Now, moving on to the cycling training group. So the white here, this is cycling, the group that only did cycling. When you measured the change in their VO2 max from January to March, after 12 weeks of training on a bike, cycling training, it's not surprising, their VO2 max went up here about 20%, which is quite a bit. But that's kind of what you would expect, right? Their exercise training, you get these adaptations. But when the cycling training group went and did a VO2 max test for arm cycling, it also went up, right? They haven't trained the arms at all. Nothing's going on with the arms. But because of cycling, leg cycling, their arm cycling VO2 max goes up. How does that work with specificity? or maybe it's just a fluke. Let's look at the arm cycling group. The arm cycling group, when you looked at their VO2 max during arm cycling, it went up about 20% or so, right? So they got much, much better. If you put the group that trained with arm cycling on an normal bike, it didn't go up as much, but it's still, they saw a significant increase in their cycling, leg cycling VO2 max. How does this work with the law of specificity? They didn't even train their arms or their legs, but the legs got better. The point here is that it's not just the location of the muscle that's exercising, but all the systems involved. And during arm cycling and leg cycling exercise, you're also putting a strain on the heart and on the lungs. So you get adaptations there as well. So this is actually kind of a cool deal. Let's say that you break your legs. You're a cross-country runner, you break your legs, you can't run for a while. One thing that you can potentially do is arm cycle so that at least you're overloading the heart and lungs still. You're not going to overload the legs directly, but you're still going to keep the heart and the lungs involved so that they get an overload or a stimulus and a reason not to lose capacity. So specificity. And then reversibility, you lose it, right? I don't think we need to focus too much on reversibility. You guys understand that concept. So what's happening to VO2 max with training? Here is reversibility. Let's focus on detraining. This is actually a really cool graph I forgot I had in here. So this is from people stopping exercise and kind of going on bed rest for a while. So let me highlight the VO2 max. So if this is your VO2 max, is percent change. So right here at 0, that represents where you started. A decrease would mean you're losing capacity, an increase would mean you're gaining capacity. So with detraining, so some of this data would be pulled from people laying in a bed after surgery. Some people would be, some of this might be from astronauts. Some of this might be from being put on crutches. We've done some of these studies at BYU. But what you see is within about 12 days, 14 days of detraining, you can see about a 6 to 7% decrease in VO2 max. And then that kind of keeps on going down over time. All right. So VO2 max goes down with detraining, and it happens quite quickly. Now, what's causing that decrease? One of the first things to go down is your cardiac output and your stroke volume. So the purple is stroke volume. It goes down really quickly and stays down. Similar with the cardiac output. Most of that change in cardiac output is going to be due to your stroke volume. The heart rate max actually is increasing a little bit. So let's look just for review. Cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. And so we've seen that cardiac output is going down in the red over here. So the reason it's going down is because stroke volume is going down. Heart rate max tends to go up a little bit with training, not a whole lot. So why is stroke volume going down? Well, your heart can remodel over time. If you're not putting a lot of strain on it, the heart rate or the size of the heart will decrease. This happens definitely over the course of a couple months. You can see the size of the left ventricle will decrease to where it's smaller and smaller. That's a major factor in here. And you can also see changes in blood volume with time. This is also probably most of this quick part here where you see a decrease in cardiac output and stroke volume within 2 weeks. A lot of that's probably due to losses in blood volume. When you detrain, you lose blood volume. Your heart retains less, or your body retains less blood. And that means that you have less blood to pump around. All right. So things change rather quickly when you start to detrain. Now, Wow, that one was out of place. Okay, so that was detraining. Now let's review what is going on, or how would these factors improve VO2 max? So listed over here are a lot of things that happen with training, with endurance training, right? You get an increase in the type 1 fibers. You have an increase in plasma volume, which helps with increased venous return. You have increased contractility of the heart. You also get increased mitochondrial density in the skeletal muscle. Also, the heart gets more mitochondria. You have a decreased afterload against the heart and increased capillary density, increased muscle mass. How are all these things going to affect it? I'm not going to stop and talk about this right now. I want you guys to pause it and study this on your own. Ask yourself, what is increased number of type 1 fibers going to do for me? You get increased number of type 1 fibers with endurance training. Why is that beneficial? How does that increase VO2 max? Okay, look after these things. One thing you might not come across very clearly for a lot of people is the increased muscle mass. You need muscle to consume oxygen. If you don't have muscle, you can't consume it, right? The muscle is big, has a lot of your mitochondria, which is consuming the oxygen. So more muscle means you can do more exercise and have a greater VO2 max, right? So there is benefit of having increased muscle mass in terms of exercise capacity. And you see this in aging. Older individuals get something called sarcopenia. And sarcopenia is the attrition or loss of muscle mass with aging. And so the muscles start to shrink, get smaller and smaller. And what does that mean? They have less muscle to consume oxygen. Their VO2 max is going to go down. Their critical power is going to go down. They're going to fatigue a lot faster. Less muscle mass means that if you're lifting 100 pounds of weight, that 100 pounds of weight is going to be distributed to less muscle. So it has to be responsible for lifting more. And that's going to increase fatigue, right? So muscle mass is very important in these adaptations that you get with endurance training and strength training as well. So with stroke volume, let me erase this. With cardiac output, you get that increase in stroke volume, increased preload, decreased afterload. The decreased afterload is going to come because you have more capillaries, more arteries, which can accommodate a greater volume of blood, and you also have more dilation of those arteries. So that results in a lower diastolic blood pressure, less afterload, and that allows you to eject more blood, right? You have a greater stroke volume. And now in terms of the AVO2 difference, you have a lot of different things going on. Some of the stuff captured in this graph, you'll get increased blood flow because of the capillary density and artery function. You also have more capillaries and mitochondria, which help with extraction, less sympathetic activity during a submaximal exercise. Several other things are going on here to facilitate the movement of oxygen into the mitochondria. All right, so one thing, I want to take a second and review what happens to, or why type 1 motor units are so good for endurance training, right? It's been a long time since we talked about this. If you remember, we have these two different fiber types. We have our type 1 fiber types and our type 2. Among those type 2 fiber types, we have type 2A and then type 2X. The type 2X they're bigger to begin with, but they don't have a lot of endurance. Your type 2A, they can also be big and they can hypertrophy and get very big, but they also have a decent amount of endurance because of mitochondria. The endurance training, when you endurance train, the general pattern is to see everything go towards a type 1 phenotype. Everything gets more mitochondria, more like a type 1 fiber. So let's just review really quick. Why would you do that? Let's talk about differences. What makes the type 1 nervous system special? In the nervous system, you have several things that are different. They have smaller axons. And what does that small axon mean? Why would that matter at all? Well, the small axons and small neurons of the type 1 units allows them to be recruited first. So if you come over to our size principle over here, because the small axons are there on the type 1 fibers, it doesn't take a lot of EPSPs or excitatory potentials to bring the voltage up to threshold. So they're easy to recruit. That's why we recruit the type 1 fibers first. Okay, so small axon means that you can get to threshold. You guys remember this from way back? So if we have our threshold here, this would be millivolts. We have resting membrane potential. You get EPSPs bringing you up, and then you get your action potential, right? By having a small axon, it takes fewer EPSPs to get up to threshold, so you can have your action potential at the neuron and then ultimately at the muscle faster. Also other things in the nervous system is that this kind of goes with excitation too. I'll put it on excitation. The type 1 units release less acetylcholine per action potential. Now that might sound like a bad thing, but it's actually good because it means that you can keep on doing action potentials. You can keep releasing acetylcholine and have repeated stimuli. Whereas with the type 2 fibers, they release a lot of acetylcholine from the end of that axon terminal, and they fatigue, they run out pretty quickly. So the type 1 fibers allow you to keep stimulating the muscle. Other things going on in excitation is these ones have less hyperpolarization. So they have less hyperpolarization of the muscle membrane. In type 2 fibers, when they start to run out of ATP, they're very sensitive to the levels of ATP, those type 2 fibers. And so when the metabolism isn't sufficient to keep ATP levels good, they hyperpolarize. They have potassium leave the cell, which brings down the membrane potential. Remember the membrane potential, your muscles have it too. So if this is your threshold that you need to get to have an action potential in the muscle, when the type 2 fibers get low ATP, they hyperpolarize, meaning they get further from threshold, which makes it harder to stimulate the muscle and generate an action potential and ultimately a twitch or contraction in the muscle. The type 1 fibers are more resilient to that. In the contraction, what things are going on with the type 1 fibers in the contraction? They're slow twitch. And what that means is that with the type 1 fibers, they hold on to the ADP and the contraction a little bit longer. So that means when you are going through your cross-bridge cycle where the actin and myosin are hooking up together, you don't have to go through the cycle as many times to hold a contraction. Because the fast twitch, when myosin grabs on, it lets go really quickly. And so if you're trying to do a quick shortening and quick contraction, generate a lot of force with those type 2 fibers, you have to go through that cycle a lot. Whereas with the type 1 fibers, it happens more slowly. Every time the actin and myosin are hitting up, you're using an ATP, right? Because that happens more slowly in the type 1 fibers, you use less ATP, which means you're more efficient. But they have less force, right? They don't generate as much power. Another thing with energy production, this is huge here. Everything about the type 1 fibers is fine-tuned for aerobic metabolism. This crazy pen is going to drive me nuts, guys. There we go. Again, I'm not touching anything. This is just your comic relief of me complaining about. All right, so everything is fine-tuned for aerobic metabolism. So that goes along as we go often think mitochondria.
type 1 fibers have a lot of mitochondria, which are very good at performing aerobic metabolism and providing sustainable rates of ATP synthesis.
They're smaller. The fibers themselves are smaller. Now, what the consequence of that is that when you have the capillaries hooking up with the fiber, so let's pretend like this is a muscle fiber and we have little capillaries around it. If you're on a type 2 fiber, we'll say this is a type 2, they on average have somewhere around 2 to 3 capillaries in contact with it. And when the capillaries deliver the oxygen, it has to diffuse kind of a long ways to maintain oxygen to the whole muscle. Your type 1 fibers, they're smaller and they have more capillaries, usually somewhere around 4 capillaries in contact with it. So that means that the capillaries are in contact with a greater proportion of the muscle, and you can diffuse oxygen into the muscle a little more readily. Everything about the type 1 fibers is fine-tuned to be good for endurance, aerobic metabolism. All right. So now let's talk about what happens to the muscle, what physiology is going on to allow you to exercise better at a submaximal exercise. This is an oxygen uptake diagram. So this comes from, we learned about this before the second exam. So here is the oxygen kinetics before training. So let's say you have someone run 7 miles per hour before and after endurance training. Before endurance training, it'll take them a while to get up to steady state, but they eventually do. After endurance training, you get a faster rise and then maintain the same, if not a little lower, VO2. So one of the major adaptations with endurance training is that you get a faster rise. You get up to a steady state more rapidly. Why would that be beneficial? Remember back to your oxygen deficit diagrams. Remember, this is how I drew them in the past. We have ATP consumption or resynthesis. Now, ATP consumption, when you do any kind of exercise, it goes up right away, right? You have all that ATP. If you're running 7 miles per hour, to run 7 miles per hour, you need this much ATP. It's roughly constant for a person. We'll see later that with prolonged endurance training, like with Paula Radcliffe, that you can get a little more efficient, require less ATP, but not a huge effect. So usually for a given power output, it requires the same amount of ATP. So now before training, let's see if I can do this. So before training, your oxygen consumption can resynthesize ATP, your aerobic metabolism, that's all resynthesizing ATP aerobically. What is making up for the difference here? You still are consuming ATP, but you're not getting it aerobically. That yellow is where it's your oxygen deficit, where you're tapping into your anaerobic stores. And it's not sustainable. The more you use this yellow, the less sustainable it is, right? So with endurance training, what happens, let me erase something here. With endurance training, let me pick a better color, you're going to see that curve shift. So after training, you'll get up to the steady state more rapidly. So now look what happened to your oxygen deficit. It's less. You've been less reliant on that anaerobic source of energy. The more you can utilize aerobic metabolism and be reliant on it, the more sustainable the exercise is. And endurance training helps you be more reliant on those aerobic sources. So how is it? How are you getting to steady state faster? One of the things is you have an increase in the number of mitochondria, which makes you more sensitive to ADP and NADH and these other factors. You also have improved blood flow and oxygen delivery, which will facilitate that. Let's see what comes next on this diagram here. Oh, wow, that's confusing. Let me clear all. All right, so one other thing that I want to show you, I'm going to bring up a whiteboard here. So when you endurance train, you also get, and for submaximal exercise, let's focus submax. When you endurance train, things get easier, right? So let's say first this is ATP, how much ATP you consume. Before training, running 7 miles per hour costs you that. After training, it costs you roughly the same, maybe a little less, not much. So that's not changing, but other things will. Let's look at your heart rate. Heart rate's going to go down. So before training, running 7 miles per hour, you'll have a high heart rate. After training, it'll be less. Why? Same thing with, let's say, just lactate. Concentration of lactate in the blood. It'll be high during 7 miles per hour before training. After training, it'll be lower. What's going on? In terms of the heart rate, the heart is getting bigger, right? So you have a larger left ventricle, which allows you to have the same cardiac output with a lower heart rate. So if we change this, instead of having this say heart rate, if we said cardiac output, get rid of that. Yeah, if it said cardiac output, it would be here, not down there. Cardiac output is going to stay roughly the same for 7 miles per hour of exercise. But the heart rate goes down because now you can eject more blood with a given beat. And that saves the heart a lot of energy, actually. Lactate, you form less lactate with training. Why? You're more reliant on these type 1 fibers, which can use aerobic metabolism, and your type 2 fibers also get better at aerobic metabolism. And so you produce less lactate, less reliant on anaerobic glycolysis. All right, now let me pull up my screen again. Okay, so let's look at this. What else is going on with submaximal exercise? Endurance training, you're going to see within the muscle, the increased number of mitochondria. That increased number of mitochondria is going to help with several things. One of the things that it's going to help with is fatty acid utilization. The more mitochondria you have, the chemistry works out to be better at using fats. Also, as you have greater capillary density, you get and healthier dilation of the arteries feeding the capillaries, you can get more blood flowing to the muscle, and with the greater amount of capillaries, it actually slows the blood flow down. Think about a river. When a river gets in a really narrow spot, the water's going very quickly. You get the rapids. But if it's spread out over a big distance, the water slows down. Same idea with your capillaries. The more capillaries you have, the blood spread out across a bigger distance. So by slowing the blood down in the capillaries, it allows for better fatty acid uptake, it allows for better oxygen uptake, it allows for better glucose uptake. All of that is going to result in increased fatty acid utilization, so we can use fats more and be more reliant on those. If you remember way back, at one point I showed you a diagram like this where you have ATP resynthesis rate. And this was phosphocreatine. And then you have glycolysis. Oh, no, glycolysis didn't look like that. Glycolysis is more like this. This would be glycolysis. And then here's glucose. And then fat. So what's happening with your endurance training, let's make it pink for fun. When you endurance train, you're bringing the fat line up so that you can now sustain higher rates of ATP resynthesis with fat. The glucose will also go up. The aerobic metabolism of glucose will go up. It gets a little messy. But the main point here is that we are increasing the capacity to resynthesize ATP with fat and with glucose aerobically, and that leads to improved endurance. These are data that I collected a couple of years ago. We exercise trained people, old people like 75-year-olds, had them exercise trained, and we measured how good their arteries were at dilating and increasing blood flow. So we would measure their blood flow to their leg by doing a small little movement, by like a mini exercise, and blood flow would go up after a single movement and then come back down. After training, that same movement, same exercise, resulted in a bigger increase in blood flow. Exercise training results in healthier dilation, not just having more arteries or capillaries, but the ones that you have get healthier and direct the blood more appropriately, which allows for better aerobic metabolism. Now, with endurance training, also you get a huge increase in mitochondrial density, right? A couple years ago, I did a study where we compared untrained individuals to trained. So we had your average college student versus the college student goes out and rides their bike 100 miles on the weekend. If we looked at number of mitochondria, the untrained would be somewhere about here to you. Maybe this summer I'll work on my handwriting on the computer. And the trained had about double the mitochondria. So they have way more mitochondria. But here's the deal. In terms of aerobic exercise, like their VO2 max, the VO2 max isn't double. It's only about 20% greater. So despite having twice as many mitochondria, they only consume 20% more oxygen. So what are these extra mitochondria for? The increase in mitochondria is actually key for a lot of these submaximal adaptations that we see. By having more mitochondria, we can use fats more readily. By using fats more readily, that allows us to produce less metabolites that signal for fatigue and allows us to have greater and greater endurance. So increasing fat utilization slows down glycolysis, so we don't do this as much. We're not forming as much pyruvate or lactate, so we're not going to form as much lactate, and that means less acid from all of these different steps, and less acid means less signal for fatigue, and we can keep doing our exercise longer. Additionally, you're just not going to run out of fat. When you're exercising, you run out of your glycogen stores. They start to get depleted after about 40 minutes to 60 minutes of intense exercise. Fat, you're not going to run out of it. You got to go days and days before you start to deplete your fat, as far as we understand. So by being able to use fat for a higher intensity of exercise, it results in greater endurance. And a lot of this has to do with the fiber types. Type 1 fiber types, much better for aerobic metabolism, much better for fat utilization, and all around greater endurance. All right, now let's apply this. This is kind of fun. We're going to wrap this up by talking about Paula Radcliffe. Paula Radcliffe was the world record holder for the women's marathon for about 15 years or so, maybe more. She was way ahead of her time. In general, marathons have a trajectory where the time in the marathon decreases with time. So in 1987, this would be right about where the fastest marathon time was for 1987. And with improved training and improved competition, especially among women, increased participation, you get more people competing, and the times have this downward trend. Well, around 2002, Paula Radcliffe hit the scene, and she was way below the trend. She was faster than would be expected. In fact, it wasn't until just 2019 that someone beat her time and matched her. Right? So she was way ahead of her time. Why was she so fast? What was up with her physiology that allowed her to be faster than every other woman at her time and for 15 years after her? Now, what's really cool is that she worked with one of the best exercise physiologists around, a guy that knows a lot of stuff about critical power and a lot of stuff about VO2 max. And fortunately, while working with him, he saved a lot of the data on her from early on in her career till when she set the world record. So think about what you know as an exercise physiologist now. What things would you think would make her elite? What would you see? Write them down, start to think about them. Certainly, you're going to say VO2 max, right? So she probably has a very high VO2 max. But what other things? What other things are going on? We've seen something like this in the past. If we look at average race pace, how fast you run your race is going to be influenced a lot by the rate of aerobic metabolism that you can sustain and how you spend that, your economy. So the rate of aerobic metabolism you can sustain, that's influenced by your VO2 max. We could also put on here critical power, lactate threshold are also two key ones. Your critical power really influences it is the highest sustainable aerobic metabolism, right? So these factors are going to influence your race pace strongly and how much anaerobic contribution you can make at the beginning for the onset of your exercise and also at the end if you want to do a kick to the finish line. So these are some of the major factors that are going to influence endurance performance. So let's look at Paula Radcliffe's VO2 max. In 1992, she was just like on the junior circuit or not super popular in terms of professional racing. As far as I remember, she was like mostly a 5K, 10K runner, and her VO2 max was high, right? It was 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is really high. But it's not higher than all the other runners at her time. And look at this. This is when she set the world record. In 2003, she set one in 2002 and again in 2003. In 2003, her VO2 max was not any better than it was in 1992 when she was just a young person on the scene, not setting records or anything. So she had the high VO2 max. Elite athletes have these high VO2 maxes, but that's not it. All the elite athletes have high VO2 maxes. So there has to be something different about Paula Radcliffe that separated her from the other 50 women that have a VO2 max of 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute. One thing that helped her out is her running economy. So running economy is, you can measure this as the VO2 required to run a given speed. So listed over here, you have it in milliliters per kilogram. There should be a per minute on there, per kilometer per hour. So just the VO2 per kilometer, the VO2 required to go a kilometer at a given speed. Now, look, this is when she had a VO2 max of 70. Here she has a VO2 max of 70. But in 1992, it required her roughly 200 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram to go a kilometer. In 2003, now it's only costing her about 175 milliliters of oxygen to go a kilometer. Right? So she's getting more efficient. It costs her less oxygen and presumably less ATP to run at 16 kilometers per hour. So her VO2 max hasn't changed, but how efficient she is using her VO2 has. Now, the consequence of this is that the speed at VO2 max changed quite a bit. In 1992, her VO2 max was 70. And in 2003, her VO2 max was also 70. But when going at that 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute, in 2003, she's going a whole lot faster, about 23.5 kilometers per hour versus 20.5 kilometers per hour in 1992. So because of improvements in economy or efficiency, she's able to get more out of her VO2 max. Now, this efficiency and economy, this adapts over a long time. If you train for 8 weeks or a year, you're not going to see major changes in your economy. You'll see subtle differences here and there, but not a lot. So this improved economy is really quite exceptional. So what could it be that leads to this improved economy? One thing that can happen is increased type 1 fibers. You remember type 1 fibers are more efficient. They require less ATP and less oxygen to do a single contraction cross-bridge cycle. Over time, years and years of endurance training signals for the fiber type to gradually shift little by little, and over time, you tend to see a much greater proportion of type 1 fibers after endurance training for a long time than you would before. So she probably has a lot more type 1 fibers in 2003 than she did in 1992. And that means less oxygen required, less ATP required to go at a given speed. Okay, what about the lactate threshold? What happens to lactate threshold? Remember, the lactate threshold represents a point where you start to have an increased contribution of anaerobic metabolism. So we have blood lactate on the y-axis, running speed on the x. So right about here in 1992, somewhere around 15 kilometers per hour is the speed at which she started to have an anaerobic contribution. Now look in 2003, it's way over here. All right, so now she doesn't hit that lactate threshold or anaerobic contribution until 18 kilometers per hour. They didn't measure it, but I suspect we'd see a similar trend with her critical power, that the critical power shifted over as well to where her critical power was at a much higher speed and higher percentage of her VO2 max. What this means is now she can sustain 18 kilometers per hour is now a very sustainable speed for her. And 20 kilometers per hour is moderately sustainable. Whereas in the past, 20 kilometers per hour probably wouldn't have been sustainable for more than a couple of minutes for her. So that physiological shift is helping. And part of this could be due to improved aerobic metabolism with greater mitochondria and all of that, and the fiber type shift. All right, so what about heart rate and stroke volume? Here we see her heart rate versus running speed. So this is 1992, and as you would imagine, heart rate goes up as you increase your running speed. The faster you run, the faster your heart beats. What happens over time is that it shifts over. We see maybe a small decrease in her heart rate max, but overall, her heart rate is less for a given running speed. If we looked at cardiac output, if we have speed here, and this is cardiac output, that would be 1992. This would be 2003. They'd all be right on top of each other. The cardiac output isn't going to change all that much, but the heart rate, how she gets that cardiac output is by having a greater stroke volume. Remember, cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. By having a higher stroke volume and a low heart rate, it actually saves the heart quite a bit of energy, quite a bit of ATP. So now the heart isn't going to be as fatigued or doing as much work. Having a bigger heart size allows her to have a much greater cardiac output, lower heart rate for a given cardiac output, and it helps performance all around. All right. So the answer is to why was Paula Radcliffe so much faster than everyone else? She had the high VO2 max to begin with, and then over time, her lactate threshold and most likely her critical power shifted over to be at a higher percentage of her VO2 max, and she had a much greater running economy, so it cost her less oxygen to run a given speed. All of these things contributed to her high exercise capacity. Now, as you go through studying, make sure you can explain the physiology behind this. What causes a high VO2 max? What causes the lactate threshold to shift over? What causes the decrease in heart rate? Why are type 1 fibers important? What's going on with the action potentials and calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Just go over the whole body. The size principle, that's also another key one. Make sure you study what would happen to the size principle with endurance training. Hopefully this can help you prepare for your final exam by integrating a lot of different concepts together. At any rate, I hope you guys are doing well, and we're gonna end this recording, and yeah, best of luck studying for your final.